Excellencies, honorable speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all. I, Mr. Rudra Narayan Das, on behalf of the organizers, extend my heartfelt welcome to all to this Ranjitguru series of international webinar. This webinar is an initiative by the Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, in a close collaboration with Center for Adivasi Research and Development Studies, Odisha. I feel happy to express that we have successfully concluded the 107th round of panel discussion yesterday. Its success was officially acknowledged and announced by the All India Radio Prasar Bharati Cuttack yesterday. We have already received the congratulations from YouTube community for contributing more than 5,600 minutes of academic content in last 180 days. In today's session, to enlighten us, we have three eminent speakers who are none other than Professor Sekhar Basu, Professor Yuthika Mishra, and Professor Jyotsana Sonal. It's our pride privilege to host all of you, sir and ma'am. The broad theme of our international conclave is kept as Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020, COVID-19, and Life Practice Beyond Pandemic. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Professor Shubham Das to go for a guest introduction.
A warm greeting to all. Thanks, Rudra sir, for giving me the opportunity. Today we have with us Professor Sekhar Basu, Department of History, University of Calcutta. He has also been visiting scholar to the Department of History, Uppsala University, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Department of History, Osmania University. Dr. Basu has been awarded many fellowships, including Sastri Indo-Canadian Institute Faculty Research Fellowship, Charles Wallace Travel Grants, Wellcome Trust Travel Grants, and the Fulbright Seminar Grant, among others. He has published papers in various reputed journals such as the Indian Historical Review, Studies in History, Contemporary Perspective in History and Sociology, Seminar, Gandhi Mark, Social Science Probing, Social Scientist, and Calcutta Historical Journal. He has also contributing chapter in volumes published by leading international publishers. He has edited a volume and a monograph on Dalit history. We welcome you from the core of our heart, sir. Sir, the topic as suggested by you is India-Burma connectivities and disjunctures in 20th century. Our next guest speaker, who is none other than Dr. Yuthika Mishra. She is currently working as Associate Professor and Head Department of History at the Vivekananda College, Delhi University. She has been teaching modern history and undergraduate level at the undergraduate level for past 30 years. She has also taught subjects like tourism management and history at the Indira Gandhi National Open University at the postgraduate level. Her doctoral work was on Hindu women legislative reform, a discourse on marriage, 1920 to 1956, from Delhi University, and MPhil dissertation was entitled Tribals, Congress and National Politics on the Chotnagpur Plate, 1920 to 47, from the same university. Book on both these topics are published. She has worked on various research projects and is currently involved in a book project entitled C, Essays in Social Practice and Cultural History of Women. The Dr. Mishra's publications include articles on the Indian national movement and women issues, another one entitled Raja Mahendra Pratap, a jealous revolutionary, 1919 to 1946, and articles in Hindi for the Delhi University course book on early modern Europe and modern Europe on family, gender, marriage, and industrialization. Apart from invited lectures on these issues, she has presented papers in national and international conferences in India and abroad as well on various topics like women's property rights, women in colonial India, and women and family. Dr. Mishra has also been an active member of the All India Conference, now New Delhi, an organization established in 1927, and is honorary member in charge library research and documentation at the AIWC. She has also been associated with various projects of National Council of Educational Research and Training since 2003 and has recently been appointed as the member of Indian Historical Records Commission and is also a member in the court of Bhagat Pol Singh Women's University, Sonipat. Her areas of specialization and also of collateral interest are modern India and European history, women and family law, marriage and community studies, women's rights movements and contemporary studies. We welcome you, ma'am, from the core of our heart. Your topic for today's session as suggested by you is women and gender. Our last but not the least, our third guest speaker is Dr. Jyotsana Sonal. She had PhD and MPhil in Educational Planning and Administration from National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi. Currently, she is working as an assistant professor in the Department of History, HNB Garhwal Central University, Pauri campus, Uttarakhand. Her areas of interest includes education of disadvantaged, inclusive education, modern and contemporary social and political history, gender issue. We welcome you, madam, from the core of our hearts. Your topic for today's session as suggested by you is classroom teaching and language barrier, a case study of tribes in Uttarakhand. Now I would like to stop here and invite Professor Basu to initiate his talk. Over to Professor Basu.
Good morning. First of all, I extend my thanks and my best wishes to Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, for inviting me to participate in this panel. And this is very important in the sense that there are very few organizations which have crossed the century landmark, so as to say, when it comes to having webinar series. And here what we hear now is that it is well past the 100 mark. So congratulations to the college and to the organizing members of this particular webinar series. Now today I intend to speak on Indo-Burma connectivities and the sort of disjunctures. I would mostly concentrate on the sort of emigration that took place from the eastern seaboard of British India, meaning the coastal states of Bengal, Odisha, and the northern Sircars and down to Tamil Nadu, and look into it from sort of a grand perspective, starting from right from the 1830s, 40s, when immigration became a very important issue in the life experience of the Indians, and down till the end of the Second World War, when people returned back from territories like Burma under the spell of decolonization, virtually with very little in hand. Most of the people had become poor. They couldn't carry back their wealth back to India. Now, this is a story where you have happiness, you have joy. At the same time, you have despair, you have agony, and you have a lot of ill feelings as well. Now, modern emigration from India was wholly a British creation. Began in 1834 when slavery was established was abolished in the British Empire. Labor was needed to work in the sugar plantations in the various British colonies. And without dependable supplies of labor, survival in the plantations became extremely difficult. Consequently, the British colonists, they followed the practice of Latin America and Cuban colonists who were importing Chinese indentured labor from the Portuguese settlements like Macau, and Indian laborers were also found to be useful in some of the colonies as well. Now, in India, as scholars like Kingsley Davis and others have pointed out, pressure to emigrate had always been great enough to provide a stream of immigrants much larger than the actual figure of the opportunities. Large-scale Indian emigration did not take place until the establishment of British imperialism in India, as well as many other parts of the world. Burma, for example, is a case in point where Indian emigration was numerically insignificant and only seasonal in nature until the annexation of the Irrawaddy Delta and the Northern Territory by the East India Company sometime in the early 1850s. Now, it is very clear that in the 1830s, there were very few Indians. Total about 19 Indians were there in Rangoon. And if one looks into the pattern of migration in the case of Burma, Ceylon, and Malaysia, the figures are relatively higher, much higher in the early 1890s, when laborers emigrated to these foreign lands, quote unquote, under the Kangani or the Maestri systems of recruitment. There was a definite decrease during the First World War years. In 1917, the indentured emigration came to an end, and it provided ample opportunities for people to migrate under the free or the unassisted form of migration. However, the demand for Indian labor increased due to the rising fortunes of tea, rice, and rubber plantations in Ceylon, Burma, and Malaysia. And we find that after the First World War years, there was a great deal of increase, but certainly between 1926 and 1930, there was a large number of return emigres because there was a slump in the plantation sector, which was worsened by the global economic crisis. Now, during the crisis years and the post-depression era until 1937, more and more number of Indians returned back home than they left the shores of India. The Kangani or the Maestri system came to a halt in 1938. But by then, not only sufficient labor had been available to these Southeast Asian colonies, Indian public opinion was also opposed to Indian emigration and ill treatment abroad. So by the years between 1860 and 1940, probably 10 million Indian immigrants moved back and forth between India, Burma, Ceylon, and Malaysia. Historians like Arasa Ratnam have pointed out that majority of the Indian immigrants who went to these countries, I mean Burma, Ceylon, and Malaysia, primarily I'll be speaking on Burma, were Tamil-speaking Hindus, quote unquote, the remainder being Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians. Apart from a large number of laboring population, the majority of the people who emigrated were from the laboring stock. There were considerable numbers of people who were engaged as petty traders, shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, salesmen, clerks, and professionals. In the case of both Burma and Malaya, the Indian business community comprised mostly of Tamil Chettiars, who actually exercised almost a near complete domination over the commercial and business establishments in Burma till the Second World War years. Interestingly, much before the fear of the Japanese onslaught had found its way into the Indian hearts, there had been all thoughts of a speedy evacuation from Burma. And because this threat was imminent, most people risked their savings and movable and immovable securities and left back for India, trudging long distances through the forests, reaching the forests of Assam, many of them dying on their way, and finally getting into the railway into the railway links of Assam to be taken to Calcutta by train. Now, while this is true, the Indo-Burmese riots, the Indo-Burman riots of 1937, had also been responsible for this Indian migration. It had certainly dampened the spirits of the Indians, and many Indians felt that their success story, which they had scripted in Burma, was going to be lost sooner or later. And we find that the government of Burma, after going through the riot inquiry report, which was submitted by a commission of inquiry under J. Baxter, with the primary motive of tried to get into the primary motive of the questions which had always been there regarding Indian immigration to Burma. And Baxter, after investigating the issue of Indian immigration, with the help of an Indian and Burmese assessor, reached the conclusion that Indian nationals entering into Burma had to possess a duly registered Indian passport, and they had to obtain a visa from a competent authority under the government of Burma. It was very clear that bureaucratic red tapeism in the name of passport, in the name of proper documents, immigration documents, were now forcing their way into the minds of the Indians, and more number of Indians were becoming petrified that this opportunity would be lost. Now, the long history of migration to Burma from India would bring out several other factors. Firstly, most of the people who went to Burma were seen as a fluid labor supply. They were cheaper to hire and manage compared to the native Burmese workers. Their accommodation or living costs were relatively lower, since they would be housed in substandard tenements. By comparison, Burmese workers were relatively immobile, preferring their employments close to their home districts and required individual units. Secondly, the Burmese were primarily agriculturists and were not suited to work for long hours in the mills which came up along the rail tracks in Burma in the 1860s and 1870s. Thirdly, the European firms preferred to deal with the head maestries to hire and manage the workers rather than hire the Burmese workers on individual contracts. Moreover, there was no Burmese maestries who were in a position to make contracts with European firms or finance their own labor gangs. There was a marked preference for male migrants, and this explains why males migrated in larger numbers from India, from the coastal regions of India to Burma. And the other was the element of seasonality of employment, which also had an impact or impacted on the sex ratios in Burma. There was a wide divergence due to occupational and caste class differentiation. High caste class men left their families behind in India, since they traveled frequently between the two colonies. As Amarjit Kaur has pointed out, Chittagonians and Odias employed on ships as engine room and deck deck laborers also left their families behind due to the nature of their occupation. Moreover, the living conditions of the urban factory workers are residing in cramped quarters and lack of privacy discourage workers on short-term contracts from bringing their spouses. Indian birth rates in Burma were thus low, prostitution was rife, and sexually transmitted diseases were very much high, so far as the Indian working class population was concerned. But where does Bengal, which is a part of the eastern seaboard in India, figure in all this story, where we seem to be guided because we are most of the time guided by the concerns of political economy, with which we started doing our research careers in the early 1990s. When you think about Burma and Bengal, there is a great deal of emotional cartography that has to be located, and there is much of shared and layered histories which make up the spaces occupied by the Bay of Bengal. Sonal Amrit and Sugata Bose have tried to look into the pre-colonial connections between South Asian nations and the presence of a cosmopolitan world across the Bay of Bengal, that existed before the advent of colonial regimes. Rajat Rai emphasized more on the pre-colonial Indian and Chinese chains of trade and finance, ranging from Zanzibar to Singapore, which formed a distinct international system that never lost its identity in the larger dominant world system of the West. Kirtinaran Chaudhary has argued that Indian Ocean blends imperceptibly into Asia, comprising Chinese, Sanskritic, Indian, and Southeast Asian civilizations. In fact, the seas are seen as flexible highways influencing vernacular politics and connections that emanated from these links. The long historical links between Bengal and Burma were transformed on both sides by the experiences of British colonization. This is demonstrated clearly in the novels, stories, autobiographies, and memoirs written by Bengalis who had traveled and lived in Burma. The hierarchies of fear, desire, and power, which all impacted in the Bengali mind, were structured and experienced in radically very different ways. The Second World War and the collapse of the British rule in South and Southeast Asia led to an erasure of this long-standing relationships between Bengal and Burma. Burma was gradually, as we know, annexed to British India through a series of wars, popularly known as the Anglo-Burmese Wars of the 19th century. Burma, which had shared historical ties with India through its Buddhist identity and the old Arakanese Buddhist tradition, faced constant threats by the British regime to overlook them. However, the sense of Hindu-Buddhist brotherhood prevailed until the late 1930s. The Buddhist Renaissance, inaugurated by Angarika Dharmapala through his Mahabodhi movement in the 1890s, strongly criticized the Muslim rule for the decay of Buddhism in India, but asserted the close ties with Bengal, which was a strong center of Buddhism between the 5th and the 12th centuries. In 1936, Shuniti Kumar Chattopadhyay, the well-known internationally well-known Bengali linguist, the doyen of the Bengal Academia and part of the Calcutta University caucus, tried to bring out the etymological commonness between the Burmese and the Indian languages, interpreting these trajectories in terms of a shared Buddhist past. Chattopadhyay called the Burmese distant cousins and referred to a number of old Sanskrit and Pali names of various regimes in Burma. In the years when a section of the Bengali Academia had been drawn towards a debate on Brihat Bharatvarsho or Greater India, Chattopadhyay felt that Burma was tied to India through the Greater Indic Dharmarajyo, a kingdom of shared religious roots. But all was not common between Bengal and Burma, as was romanticized by Chattopadhyay to some extent. In fact, there were differences in physical features, and the economic and social structures were quite different. Burma had lesser number of landed elites, and it was a reasonably prosperous agrarian society, and literacy figures were believed to be comparatively higher than Bengal. There was a small section of the Burmese middle class who shared a love for Calcutta because of its famed educational institutions like the Presidency College, the University of Calcutta, and the Calcutta Medical College. The monk U. Uttama, who opposed the separation of Burma from British India, was associated with the Bengal National College and had studied in Calcutta for 3 years before traveling around India. By 1911, more than 1 lakh people were arriving in Burma from India every year by steamship from various eastern ports, doing everything from rickshaw pulling, working in docks and rice mills, trading in rice and other commodities, working in railway heads and customs offices, and financing the development of rice paddy cultivation throughout the Irrawaddy River Delta. The Indians were a majority in the early 20th century in terms of population in the largest cities in Burma: Rangoon, modern-day Yangon, Akiab, Sitaway, Basin, modern-day Patien, and Molmen. For the vast majority of Indians in Burma, Burma was a land of gold, Suvarna Bhumi, a space of infinite possibilities. Suniti Kumar Chattopadhyay had used the term Suvarna Bhumi for Burma, borrowing this terminology from ancient Sanskrit texts. A poet written by an obscure Odia poet whose identity has not been found, from Cuttack in 1918, gives ample evidence that Burma was a land where people could become extremely wealthy very quickly. And a translation from the Odia to English would be as follows: you will be amazed how much you can earn over 3 years. You will be paid 1 rupee if you cut down a banana plant. You will amass money as people pile cow dung cakes. Here, they till the land and sow it with seeds. They don't have to weed the fields. It rains every day. This is a land blessed by Lakshmi, the goddess of property. Property. The fields are the fields are flat and fat with crops. Now, this is an ample example from the Odia poet's narrative on Burma. Sharachandra Chattopadhyay's novel Srikanto, which is the story of a Bengali Brahmin, educated, unemployed youth who is living in a hand-to-mouth condition in Bengal, decides on a passage to Burma, a land whose streets are supposedly paved with gold and where Bengalis as such are at a premium. The Bengali babus are so much in demand that they are bodily lifted from the ships, carrying them, and the people carry them to the shore, and there they are employed by the Englishmen with jobs, money, power in jobs which fetch high money, power, and also give them power and prestige. Amitabh Ghosh's historical novel, The Glass Palace, deconstructs and celebrates this trope. Rajkumar, a major character, is lured into Burma in the 1880s by a labor contractor who assures him that no one ever starves in Burma. Ghosh's interesting narrative shows how British capitalism acted as a disciplining force and, buttressed by superior technology, transformed the ancient Burmese culture and traditions. The idea of Burma as a land of infinite possibilities was also demonstrated by the fact that from the 1820s, Burma became a center of radical politics because there was more and more involvement of Bengali revolutionaries who escaped to Burma simply to keep themselves away from British surveillance. The import of printed materials from Bengal to Burma nonetheless came under strict surveillance by the British intelligence. The editor of the Rangoon Mail, a Bengali by the name of Nipen Banerjee, was deported in 1927. The same year, Sharachandra Chattopadhyay's Bengali novel Pather Dabi was proscribed by the British. Revolutionaries like Bhupendra Kumar Datta were deported to Mandalay jail, where he came in contact with Trailokya Chakraborty and Hari Kumar Chakraborty, as well as Subhash Bose, who was jailed there in 1925. Datta's very famous tract, I would say, written by Datta, Biplaber Padochinno, narrates in details the contacts of the Bengali revolutionaries with the Burmese. Gandhi, during his visit to Burma in 1929, reminded the crowd of Balgangadhar Tilak's imprisonment in the Mandalay jail. In fact, like the Andamans, Burma was also significant for Indians as a place for incarceration, where nationalists including Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal had been jailed. By the late 1930s, while this is the story, by the late 1930s, there was extensive presence of Indians in Burma, possibly leading to a rise in Burmese frustration and ultimately getting into a situation where the riots became inevitable. Now, Suniti Kumar Chattopadhyay, once again, he visits Burma in 1936. And he's quite aware of the antagonism that has now come to prevail between the Indians and the Burmese. He advises the Bengalis to accept Burmese nationality. There is nothing to fear about this, he says. They would get closer to the Burmese. But he was against the changing of names and favored the retention of the mother tongue, though he was sensitive to the complexities of living in a different culture. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had also said that Burma was never a part of Bharatvarsha. Tagore made 3 visits to Burma, 1960, 1924, and 1927. And he was very critical of the double colonialism of the British and the Indians, which had transformed Rangoon into the most unpleasant form of Banijya Lakshmi. Tagore did not like this brazen commercialization that had taken place under the aegis of the British Empire. Other than the Shivdagan temple, Tagore did not find anything in the city which was distinctively Burmese. It had become transformed, it had been transformed into an Indian port city to Tagore. Rajashri Majumdar, in her recent researches, has described the events in the period from the late 1930s to the Japanese invasion that saw an end to the Indian idyll in Burma. In fact, there were repeated news items in the Burmese newspapers which branded the Indians as outsiders and expressed resentment against their settlement in the country. Sharachandra Chattopadhyay and Rabindranath Tagore, two of the most famous Bengali literateurs, nonetheless had other things to say. Had other things to say because they wrote very fascinating and ambivalent stories set in Burma. But there were also memoirs, autobiographies, reminiscences, where this where there is a very different, where there are narratives of a very different world, and obviously they ignore the colonial civilizing mission of the British Empire in Burma. Now, to take up Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, he presents a very complex and a politicized version of the fate of Indians in Burma. His views are to be found in 2 novels, Shrikanto, as I have talked about, and also Pothed Dabi, and a short story Chobi, a tale of true love between Ma Shaway and Bao Thioin, their misunderstanding and union. His depictions were based on his experience in Burma, where he worked for several years, some part of which saw his involvement as a government clerk. His understanding of women as revealed through his characters represent the freedom of women from the thrall of caste and custom, breaking the taboos that existed in India. This is revealed in the character of Abhaya, a woman who is believed to have been living with another man when deserted by her husband, who had been attracted to a Burmese lover. Chattopadhyay represents the freedom of women by talking about the free life of the Burmese, unhindered by customs and practices as extant in India. Sharat Babu's depiction matches with the views of Gandhi, who, after visiting Burma in the early years of the 20th century, eloquently described the customs and hairstyles of the Burmese women, though he was critical of the laxity of the menfolk. Rameshwari Nehru, likewise in the early decades of the 20th century, made a visit to Burma and published an ethnographic account of Burmese women in the Stri Darpan, a women's magazine, where she highlighted the economic independence and social emancipation in regard to the Burmese women, something which has also been talked about by literary historians like Shobna Nijavan. However, these depictions were too often imageries which hid the real life experiences. In fact, there are portions in Sharat Babu's Srikanto which provide a sort of glimpse into the licentiousness of the Bengali Babus when it came to their social relations with the Burmese women. This is revealed in the statement of a young Bengali man who had been living with a devoted, humble Burmese woman. His decision to return to India was the cause of extreme grief for his Burmese lover. However, the Bengali man, when asked by Srikanto whether his decision to leave Burma permanently would put the woman in a grievous state. The man observed, grieved? Burmese women are filthy prostitutes with no caste. This one will hook another man before the ship sails from the harbor. This slut eats nepi, a pickle of decomposed fish called guanpi, and the stink. It is unbearable. There is nothing like our women, sir. So you can well imagine that this is the other side of the story. There is also a reference in Sharad Babu about how a man masquerades as one immersed in grief and falsely pretends to his Burmese lover that he would return to India at the slightest pretext. He discloses his real plans in Bengali to Sharat Chandra, and there he says that he is never going to return back to Burma. The girl hid her face in the end of her sari and wept inconsolably. The man wailed in Burmese mixed with vulgarized Bengali. Of course, I'm not going for a month. I'm never coming back. Oh, my jewel, I'm giving you the finger ring. I have taken your 500 rupees, everything you had. I tried to sell your house, but I couldn't make that deal. So you can well imagine how exploitative the relationship was between the Bengali babus and their Burmese mistresses. But this beauty and elegance of the Burmese women is only an act of masqueradance because it hides the impulsive and unfeminine characteristics. The same gentlewoman could become involved in violent acts such as beating a poor rickshaw puller. Many Indian women who lived with the Burmese women despised them because they were believed to be of loose morals, which was the hallmark of the Burmese society, as analyzed by them. As Charangi, Odia poet, in his poem, says that Burmese women are full of all manners of seductive tricks. They make you fall for them and they loot everything you own. Thus, the independence and emancipation available to women in Burma are a smokescreen which hides the aggression, the breakdown of marital relations, and the avarice that is there in Burma. This is not just Burma that literatures present before the reading public. Tagore's experiment in Shantiniketan, on the other hand, it was coincided with the national education movement in Burma, which was later integrated into the Burmese nationalist movement. A Buddhist national college at Shwekin Monastery was opened on August 14, 1921, with 70 odd students and 11 fundamental staff, 6 of whom were Burmese, 2 were from South India, and 4 were from Bengal. Tagore was welcomed in Rangoon. The editor of the Rangoon Mail, a Bengali Ripendra Chandra Banerjee, whom I have talked about, acted as his host. And Shapna Bhattacharya cites from the Rangoon Mail in its editorials, where it had been observed, may we in India and Burma rise to a proper comprehension of Rabindranath's message and his work in honoring such a personality in helping the cause he holds so dear. Burma will be honoring the best in her own soul, unquote. Now, in Tagore's short story, Dalia, there is an attempt to repudiate the fact that a Burmese king could murder an Indian Muslim king, Shah Shuja, who had sought marriage with his daughter. Shapna Bhattacharya, once again, is of the opinion that Tagore could not really reconcile to this sort of interpretation, since his visits to Southeast Asian countries convinced him that the message of Buddhism was one of tolerance and peace. Finally, Sharat Chandra's Pather Dabi was banned on the ground of sedition between 1927 and 1939. The ban was finally lifted by the Fazlul Haq Ministry in Bengal. The novel has details about the revolutionary activities in Burma, the racial injustices which affected the Indian working classes, and upholds a discussion of terrorism through the through the orbit of anti-colonial disaffection. Sharat Chandra does not ally with trends associated with Burmese nationalism, but rather talks about the debates among the Indians in Burma about the alternatives to the nationalist movement in Burma, as was devised by the Burmese themselves. Nonetheless, he was very critical about the double standards of the British and Indian capitalists in Burma and the oppression of the Indians by the British and the Anglo-Indian bureaucrats. Chattopadhyay also condemned the deep-rooted custom of religion, law, and social structure, and the cowardice of the native Indians. As Devalina Ghosh has argued that in Pathet Dabi, uh, mm, there are various ways through which people masquerade and uh, disguise in order to deal with the very exploitative designs of the British colonies. Now, to to conclude, let me talk about uh, what was happening in the early 1940s when the clouds of war had gathered over Southeast Asia and were quickly traversing across the Bay of Bengal to South Asia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's official powers, which have been official papers which have been released by the U.S. State Department, brings to our notice that Burma's connection with India was still important. Apart from the Dutch East Indies and Iran, a significant part of India's petroleum demands were met by the Burmese oil fields. However, there was an apprehension that the closure of the port of Rangoon, apart from cutting off oil supplies to India from Burma, would put India into a very difficult position, making it totally dependent on the United States for the supply of petrol and kerosene. In fact, these statements take us to a very different narrative centering around the dependence of India on the Burmese refineries, namely those owned by the Indo-Burma Petroleum Company, which had its refineries in Selkil, in Pantha, in Tilawa, in Syria, in Yanguan and Minbu, all of which had some connections with the oil fields in Digboy, maintained under the banner of the Assam Oil Company. But I'm more concerned with the other stories. These are set in the backdrop of trainloads of refugees arriving in Calcutta from the railheads in Assam, like Dimapur, like South Tirap and Margarita, which were filled with men, women, and children. They had all escaped from the Japanese, trudging miles out of Burma, reaching to the towns of Assam, physically and mentally drained. They were not only Indians, but British and Anglo-Indian evacuees. At Shialda station, they were exposed to thousands of men and women, noises of steam engines, bells, and myriad voices of hawkers selling a variety of wares. There were high-ranking British officials who made their way with the poor Indian laborers to Beau Bazaar Street in central Calcutta, where they were given temporary residence. Perhaps it was the last time in their lives that they should be sharing their stories of agony and displacement, and that too in very unhappy uh, residential locale. But those who made it to Calcutta were destined for a new life. Compared to 10,000 evacuees who died in the jungles of Burma before they reached the Indian borders, this was going to be a totally different experience. In fact, the majority of the Indian evacuees were made up of men who were engaged as menials, porters, coolies, chaprasis, chowkidars, sweepers, peons, paniwalas, khalasis, cultivators, and the like. They had been the foundations of the colonial regime in Burma, and they had no wish to strengthen the imperial regime in India. Anonymity seemed to be the best defense against any exploitation. The majority of them were illiterate. They have left behind no records. They did not write letters. Very little is known about them or their experiences after they reach India from Burma. But certainly when Amitabh Ghosh began writing about these developments, information to some extent was available. For example, we have uh, a version from Dr. Krishnan Gurumurthy, who was an evacuee, a boy of 9 when he arrived with his father in Calcutta. It took 10 days for him to travel from Calcutta to Madras by train. And in the words of Gurumurthy, at every major station, people from villages flocked to the train and showered us with delicacies, fruits, and beverages. The affection shown to us by the Bengalis, the Orias, and Andhras en route was touching. At that time, the fervor of patriotism and freedom from British rule was such that everyone was vying with each other to do their best for their fellow men. But this feeling of joy is only one side of the story. There were thousands who realized that their husbands, sons, and fathers had arrived home empty handed. These were the men who had borne loneliness, lived in squalid hovels, and withstood hostility and disdain for very little reward. Furthermore, they had to endure the indignities of having to trek out of Burma. In fact, there was a different experience for the wealthier categories of Indians, some of whom had their families in Calcutta. For example, the Sinhas owned the largest sugar factory in Burma. There were also Archipal, Malakars, and Chaudhuris who operated substantial networks of inland waterways transport services between Calcutta and Rangoon and other Burmese port towns. There were also wealthy Bengalis who had been able to transfer their profits back to Calcutta or in the Bengal districts because they had earned a lot of money as property dealers, as entrepreneurs, as merchants and financiers. Abdul Bari Chaudhuri was perhaps the wealthiest of them all, and he merged his Bengal Burma Steam Navigation Company with the Scindia Steam Navigation Company in the 1940s to form a vast conglomerate. But there were others, namely the middle-class Europeans and Anglo-Burmese refugees who were unable to afford hotel prices and rented rooms in Roman Catholic convents and preferred to live in charitable institutions after they returned back to Calcutta. Yet this was expensive. They had been much better in Burma than what they experienced in Calcutta. But certainly their life was much better than the majority of the Indian evacuees who had failed to find any housing in Calcutta. Let me talk of an Anglo-Indian, Ian D. Mello, who was born into an Eurasian family and who was evacuated by boat to Calcutta. Initially, they passed from one refugee camp to another, but first to Ranchi, then to Jhansi, and then to Chunar on the river Ganges between Banaras and Allahabad, where they lived till the end of the war. Calcutta was also agog with impecunious displaced middle-class British exiles. There were lawyers, there were administrators, there were engine drivers, there were ship captains, there were teachers, there were doctors, there were businessmen, and all the like. All of them had one thing in common: they had lost their livelihood and sources of income. Although most of them had plenty of money in the bank at home, they could not get their hands on it because it was very difficult to retrieve the money from the Burmese banks. The banks in Calcutta were in a precarious state, very uncertain about their business and stability in Burma, because Calcutta was the controlling head of finance so far as Southeast Asia was concerned for banks like Greenlays or Standard Chartered or any other British banks and British insurance companies. On March 5th, 1942, senior bank officials in Calcutta met to discuss whether they could move their operations to safer locations in India because Eastern India was not safe. The meeting was inconclusive. However, the situation improved sufficiently by mid-1943 for the Burma Bank's Reconstruction Committee to open up its office in Calcutta. And it is through the setting up of this committee that many of the Anglo-Indians and Europeans got their money. And a key role was played by Sir Arthur Morse, who was the chairman of the HSBC, and he felt that these exchange banks should stay together in Calcutta, and because still, after all, Calcutta was the second seat of the British Empire, still then to them. And it would put the HSBC in a situation where they could earn higher profits. But HSBC, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation authorities, had a divided existence. Sometimes they preferred to be in Calcutta, sometimes they preferred to be close to the seat of power in Shimla. Now, the British evacuees who were at the top of the social pyramid had most to lose and furthest to, and were the farthest of all. They had lost their status, they had lost their self-respect, they had lost their beautiful homes, they had lost their exquisite possessions, they had lost their businesses, they had lost their industries, and in the eyes of the people, they were certainly a losing social category. At the same time, they suffered the most in terms of personal grief and anxiety that affected everyone at that time. For the Indians who had nothing, who had returned with nothing from Burma, after all, to their family, there was one consolation. They had returned back with their lives. But for the well-to-do English, there was a completely a different experience. Well, to go back to British society as losers meant that, after all, this would put a blot to their exalted social dignity. As a historian, why should I narrate these stories? It is because I believe they help us in unraveling the raptures, the ambiguities, and uncertainties that have dawned the relationship between the Ganga and the Irrawaddy deltas across the Bay of Bengal. I would be inclined to argue that they reveal the possibility and limits of transnational connections, linkages. They bring out the complexities and conflict-ridden relationships entwined with one another. They also bring about the element of transformation, and they also help us to reflect whether one set of processes are important or whether you look into a multiple sets of options, categories, and possibilities when you try to reconstruct the history of Burma and India in the early decades of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for nicely elaborating India-Myanmar relation in 20th century. Myanmar is now also matters a lot for India because Myanmar is the only country that sits at the intersection of India's Neighbor First policy and Act East policy. So Myanmar is India's gateway to Southeast Asia, and India is Myanmar's gateway to South Asia. So you have very nicely explained. There is a one or two questions in the chat box. I am just going to read those questions for you. One question asked by Rudra Narayan Das. Myanmar is important for India because of the geographic, historical, cultural, and economic linkages, ties that span centuries, as well as for the overall developments of northeastern Indian states. India and Myanmar relations officially got underway after the Treaty of Friendship was signed in 1991. But now China is trying to isolate Burma. So how you look at this matter?
Well, when this entire process of decolonization was set afoot in the mid-1940s, it was clear that things would not be that much rosy as people in India thought. Because after all, when these territories like Burma, Ceylon, or Malaya separate from the British Empire, they are no longer parts of the British arm in South and Southeast Asia. Then, as sovereign nations, they are bound to differ with one another, and the Burmese psyche could not obliterate this presence of the Indians in large numbers on the sort of the exploitative character of a section of Indians, particularly the Tamil Natukottai Chettiars and the Bengali business groups, and even some of the North Indian business communities who had lived and made profits in Burma. They could not really forget. They could not remove from their mindset the exploitative character of the Indians when it came to handling their women. Despite the fact that they had welcomed Tagore, they had welcomed Mahatma Gandhi, they had welcomed several other very well-known Indian national luminaries. So when in 1951 this agreement comes into existence, there is a lot of hope from a section of political elites in both countries. But political elites, mind you, are only a minuscule section of the Indian or the Burmese society. What happens to the average Indian and the average Burmese? For the average Burmese, the Indian business classes have to be driven out. So 1950s, there are continuous stories pouring in from Burma that Natukottai Chettiar's properties are getting confiscated, their wealth is being taken away, and within a few days they are being turned into paupers. Now this leads to a great deal of resentment in Tamil Nadu in the 1950s, when they feel that their own people are getting discriminated in Burma, and the Indian government is perhaps finding it very difficult to negotiate with the new Burmese authorities. Even in the 1950s, the Burmese had quoted the Chinese. There is ample evidence to prove that after 1954-55, with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in control in China, there was a southward push, and the southward push had many reasons. Nowadays, many of the scholars in international relations feel that China's initiative to one belt, one road, OBOR, at the same time its decision to revive the Stilwell route had its origins in the late 1950s, when the Chinese political circles in Beijing, in Peking, decide to enter into some deal, into some collaboration with the military junta in Burma. In the 1960s and 70s, despite Burma getting into the international headlines because of the detention of Suyuki and all sorts of things happening there, even with Suyuki's mother and father, and then finally with her, and this entire issue of loss of human rights in Burma, still the Chinese hold ground in Burma. The psyche, there is the sort of the emotional psyche that the Burmese have is more attuned to China, given its links with southern China, given its links with Chinese cities like Kunming and so on and so forth. So China in the years to come will continue to have a sway on whatever is happening in Burma rather than India, despite the Burmese, despite Burma occupying a very strategic position as from the Indian point of view, as a gateway to Southeast Asia. But if you look into all these things that have been talked about, look east and all those things, they have been more in terms of paperwork. They're more in terms of policy perspectives, which are debated and discussed in the national capital, and sometimes also discussed in the provincial capitals in Calcutta or in Bhubaneswar or in Guwahati, about the sort of possibilities that this opening up of Burma, opening up of ties with Burma is concerned in recent times. But so far as the Northeast is concerned, it is very difficult to say whether the sort of possibilities that often people project in terms of Northeast benefiting from this sort of a change in the India government's foreign policy initiative to look east, so as to say, right from the 1990s it has started. In these 30 years, what has been the result? There have been expectations. There have been a lot of things have been written by scholars and pundits of international relations. But in reality, we are still scared, because there are huge issues of security which have to be dealt with. And Northeast is very, very turbulent. And there are also intelligence reports from the Indian side that many of the Northeast revolutionaries are getting training, or they find a refuge, they find a way to Burma where they can spend a lot of time. And so if India is not able to solve the Naga problem in Nagaland, it looks highly improbable that we make any headway with with so far as Southeast Asia business world is concerned, through our forays, in terms of our forays through Burma. We cannot use Burma as a launching pad unless and until we negotiate with the rebels, or we resolve the problems in the two sister states of Northeast, Nagaland and Manipur, which actually share borders with Burma, and then move on to Mizoram, because Mizoram is also a very important player in Northeast, because it is also very close to the Chittagong Hills. So the Arakan, so even Arakan is a problematic zone. How do you deal with Arakan? Because Arakan has to be also dealt, because with the Rohingya problem there, I believe Indian government has also to speak to the Bangladeshi authorities. And how do you manage this? Because this is a very, very difficult terrain, which cannot be negotiated only from the vantage point of New Delhi. Rather, New Delhi has to actually cow down and speak in a tone of moderation with Bangladesh and Burma, and then possibly it can happen. And unless and until you tone down your sensibilities, it is very, very difficult for the Indians to actually use Burma as a vantage point that has been claimed so far as Luki's policy is concerned.
And thank you, sir. The last question is from my side. How you visualize the present scenario of India-Myanmar relationship against the backdrop of the Rohingya crisis? Just to put your brief insights.
Well, if you look into India-Burma relationships have always been in terms of highs and lows. There are expectations when there are expectations, when there are state-level visits, when there are dignitaries visiting from the Indian side, or from the Burmese or the Burmese counterparts are visiting. Even the military, the Indian military officials have visited Burma, and some of the high Burman military officials, the delegation has been to India. There have been expectations. Well, we'll be able to create a sort of a congenial situation where our relations will become much stronger than ever before. But right at the present moment, with the Rohingya problem brewing, still to be resolved there, the present government in Delhi, the regime in Delhi and the regime in Burma, seem to be somewhere or the other skeptical. The Burmese are skeptical because in a Buddhist majority country, they see the Rohingyas as a sort of a problem because of their religion. Nation building uses Buddhism as a sort of a medium which can strengthen the hands of the Burmese citizenry. On the other hand, religion is used in a very different way in terms of nation building in Bangladesh, where Islam is the binding force. And India apparently is secular. Apparently, I put into quotes and quotes, apparently secular. But whether we will be secular in terms of our thoughts so far as Rohingya is concerned is very bleak, because till today, only 40,000 Rohingyas have been accepted by Indians. And there are reports in the Indian intelligence, in the Indian intelligence sources, that many of them have very close relations with Saudi Arabia, because they have their people actually work there. They send money back to India and so on and so forth. And as a result of their Middle Eastern contacts, they are sometimes exposed to campaigns by ISIS and Al Qaeda and other Islamic radicalist groups in Middle East. So, given this sort of negative reportage that you seem to actually face when it comes to the Rohingya situation in India, and also to the sort of reports that the Burmese have so far as the Rohingya, so far as the Rohingyas are concerned, despite the fact that the Burmese military has committed a genocide. It's an international. There's an international uproar on the Burmese handling of the Rohingya, which is close to a genocide, if not a genocide, in that sense of the term. So I think Burma and India would be sharing similar types of views on Rohingyas, given their geopolitical realities at the present, but perhaps from the Indian side, the situation could change in another 10 years if there is a change in the guard so far as political control in India is concerned. At the same time, there can also be a change in the Burmese outlook if you have a far more liberal government, which actually, sets aside the aggressive Buddhist campaigners from its side. So right now, it's a very, very difficult situation to predict, because both India and the Burmese have not really negotiated with Bangladesh, which continues to provide the largest, the largest of the Rohingya rehabilitation programs in present-day world. And the Burmese and the Bangladeshi and the negotiation with the Bangladeshi authorities is very important, because despite having a friendly regime in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina Wajid's government has frequently raised this Rohingya issue in international fora, and at the same time she has accused India of shouldering less responsibilities for Rohingyas compared to what she has done in a far poor country like Bangladesh. Now, all these issues are very, very sensitive issues for the three countries to handle, and I really have no ready-made solution or remedies that you may seek from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful deliberation on India-Burma relationship. Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is joining a little before.
I have a meeting, so I have to leave now. So I have a meeting.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Yuthika Mishra. She is currently working as an associate professor and head department of history in the Vivekananda College of Delhi University. He has been teaching modern history at the undergraduate level for past 30 years. She has also taught subject like tourism and management and history at the Indira Gandhi National Open University at the postgraduate level. Ma'am, please initiate your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dash. Before I start, I think I need to thank the organizers, especially Professor Vikram Jena, for inviting me to this wonderful session. I really like the initiative that you have taken to connect students and teachers and the academic faculty like this. This is an honor and a pleasure for me also, and I hope to learn something from you all. Thank you for calling me. Can I share my screen with your permission, sir? Can I share?
Yes,
I need
yes,
to show a PPT here once.
Yes, please, ma'am.
Please give me a moment. Yeah. Can you all see this?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, continue.
Thank you. Thank you. So today's topic is women and gender. Although I am from the field of history, but all through my work has been on a sociological, anthropological, historical perspective, also legal. My work has been a lot on legal side, and this is a thank you slide. I want to thank the organizers and the speakers and the whole academic community present here. My talk would be centered around these 4 or 5 points, meaning of gender and the concept of gender, how we understand it in the context of sex and gender, or how they are different. Then maybe I would not go so much into feminism, but that's inherent in this talk. and the Indian context of gender, and if possible, if time permits, maybe how nationalism has, a gender angle to it, which of course is the topic of a separate whole lecture, but let's see how much we can knit here. So coming to the crucial question, what we understand as gender is that is it a social construct, or is it an essential part of our life? That is one thing which I would like to bring out here. Then the term which enters the sociological lexicon in the early 1970s. This is just to highlight that gender is a created term, for us to use in our day-to-day life, in our dealings with the human society. Maybe I would like to draw your attention to one thing. We use certain terms for convenience, and maybe this is one term of convenience which we have forgotten, and we have, sort of thought of it as a reality, as something which is a must, to behold or to in our daily life. And these are the few people, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel, Talcott Parsons, Margaret Mead, who have built their analysis, their academic dialogue around this term, and they have highlighted the issue of sex and gender in great details. There's a whole lot of debate around it. The concepts of gender and sex, as I said earlier, these are very important here. And one just takes it for granted, that, okay, this is nothing, there's no difference. But when you look into it deeply, as these sociologists have done, we realize that there is this difference, like when a child is born, when an infant is there, either male or female, we know that, then how do we differentiate between male and female? That is a biological thing. It is the first thing that comes to the mind is the biological characteristics of the child, the infant. Now, that way we differentiate between the male and the female. So at the first glance, the definition of sex in the biological context would appear clear-cut. This is very clear to a biological term. Now, it is indeed common knowledge that in order to create a new life, a sample of each sex, such as a male and a female, is needed. From this point of view, sex is a binary system in which two options exist. We can say that there are a number of biological differences between the two sexes. We have things like a mental image of a biological sex, and accordingly we judge their sex. So what is this mental image? That is where gender comes in. Moreover, the picture that has been drilled into our psyche regarding behavioral patterns associated with each sex superimposes this image. This image is further reinforced by our socialization patterns and individual life experiences. It is created, preserved, and handed over from one generation to another. And this image, which has been driven deep into the human psyche and has been taken for granted by all, this is called gender. So these are the two things which I wanted to highlight here in this talk. And further, as we go along, we'll see how this is coming into play in our daily lives, historically, sociologically. The terms sex and gender, they seem deceptively simple. And the questions that arise then are, should sex really be gender or gender be sex? Whether sex causes gender or whether gender is a social construct. Then there are two positions out of this emerge. These are the positions of biological essentialism and social constructionism. And these are also used in, psychology. A lot of research has been done, whether it is a position of essentialism that is driving us, or whether it's social construct. So then we also come to things like, is it a power play? Is it then the notion of patriarchy, which leads to feminism? These things are, one after another, it forms a chain. These terms are so simple that they appear to be straightforward descriptions of the most basic characteristics of human beings. Many times, both the terms are used interchangeably. They're also considered by many to be synonymous. That's one thing that we do, unknowingly. When an infant is born, it is referred to as either a male or a female, of course. We have seen that. This refers to the sex of the infant. Then sexness refers to the biological difference between male and female. On the other hand, gender is a social construct, not a biological one. But somehow, unconsciously, we interchange these two terms. It refers to all the characteristics in a society which considers proper for male and females. Whereas sex refers to male or female, gender refers to masculinity or femininity. Then these two terms emerge from here. While sex is inherited, but gender is learned through socialization into behaviors and attitudes considered appropriate for each sex. So then we now come to masculinity and femininity, which are the byproducts of socialization. Gender is a device by which society controls its members. Gender sorts people on the basis of their sex into different life experiences. It opens and closes access to power, prestige, and property. Gender is commonly mistaken for sex, but means quite a different thing. Gender does not refer to biological or physiological characteristics individuals possess at birth. This we have to really understand. As this definition of gender you can see on the screen here, the term gender refers to culturally based expectations of the roles and behaviors of males and females. This is from a UN document, and they have been emphasizing this. UN has been doing a lot of work on this. The term distinguishes the socially constructed from the biologically determined aspect of being male and female. Unlike the biology of sex, gender roles and behaviors can change historically, sometimes relatively quickly, even if aspects of these roles originated in the biological differences between the sexes. So the very important point here, how this definition or these lines are different, is that they change. The gender roles and behaviors change. And one essential thing that draws us to this is historically we have seen this changing. It's not like when I teach women's history or women's studies to PG or UG students, it emerges that they also realize while consciously handling this topic. For say, for example, 200 or even 150 years ago, the women could not come out of their houses to study, but now everyone, it is an essential part. Similarly, so many practices, what we call the socio-political religious reforms in the 19th century in modern India, they are also driving us to understand. History definitely makes us understand the changes that have been seen in the roles of women over the years. Then we can look at some of the definitions of gender and the difference we have already seen. And the difference essentially is also our socialization processes. As we all know that pink is the color of the girl and blue of boy. Why not a neutral color? Or why not a girl go for a blue color? Or, these are the simple examples that are given in a classroom situation. We also tell the students to go and question in the house. Go home and ask your mother a different set of question and a father, or maybe the same set. We have been doing these questionnaire of things, and it emerges that there is a mold in which both male and female have, put themselves in their life roles on daily basis. So that is one thing which we realize. Then we can look at some of the definitions. For example, Gerda Lerner, one of the pioneers of this subject, her book is The Creation of Patriarchy. She talks of gender, which is a costume, a mask, a straitjacket in which men and women dance their unequal dance. So she calls it a put on, an appearance, something we are all wearing on top of our human bodies. Alan Wolf, her book is At Home in Exile. There are several books by her. Of all the ways that one group has systematically mistreated another, none is more deeply rooted than the way men have subordinated women. All other discriminations pale by contrast, and she goes on giving several examples. Alice Clark is known for her work on the working women. They changed considerably over time with changing environments, and those changes require careful study because of the close bonds between women and men and women's indirect social and moral influence. Thing which we learn and there are endless definitions. We can go on. Another very interesting comment is by Margaret Mead, a cultural feminist. She is a cultural anthropologist, very well known for her lectures. She's an American. She was an American. Men may cook or weave, and this I would request you to pay deep attention to this, because this is such a hard-hitting statement, brings out everything, into the open. Men may cook or weave or dress dolls or hunt hummingbirds, but if such activities are the appropriate occupation of men, then the whole society, men and women alike, votes them as important. This is one aspect of the statement. When the same occupations are performed by women, they are regarded as less important. In a great number of human societies, men's sureness of their sex role is tied up with their right or ability to practice some activity that women are not allowed to practice, or practice some or the same activities, I would like to say here. So there are two crucial things, very important terms here: right and ability, which this paper tries to bring out. Constitutionally also we have seen, but as we see that the reality is very different. In the Constitution, in the preamble itself, it is guaranteed that everyone has equal rights, and apart from their franchise, their election power, or to stand up for election, they can contest for any political office. That's very clear here. But there would not be any discrimination on the basis of sex. And then there are several constitutional rights which have empowered women to participate in the democratic political process of the country. All this is stated through amendments, through everything. And we also see that there are about more than 72% of women which are still dependent. You can say, okay, 70, 75, this figure keeps on shifting. But then are they still dependent on someone or the other? Which also brings us to the question of the work at home. So we have to have that dignity of work if someone is doing that work. Then the other the percentage that is out of work or that is not dependent or so-called independent, that consists of economically independent women, whose full-fledged exercise of social freedom is restricted either by husbands or by society. So we call them independent, but then it's better to call them economically independent, because still their freedoms are restricted by the social mores. So this brings us to the question of the patriarchal culture, which has the effect of diluting freedom and equality in the political sphere. That is the underlying notion of patriarchy. Indeed, the existing social and economic pattern of society has marginalized women. With the result, there are few women in public life. We also see every day there's a talk of less women in politics, less women coming out. Then do we really dissect our existing social, political, economic pattern, which has led to this? This leads us all to this, the phrase feminism, which states that it is the radical notion that women are people. Why this is in bold and in big letters? Because is it a radical notion? Is it so radical that women are people? Are there different species? Of course, you can say they are from Mars or Venus and all that. That comes as a joke. This is the Western world we are talking of now. Some of the pioneers of the women movement here are seen. And I've just given a few quotes just to bring out that the feelings of women all through globally are the same. Mary Wollstonecraft talks about, she's the 19th century, during the French Revolution, she was very active. And I do not wish them, of course, the British, do not wish the women to have power over men, but over themselves. Very clearly. So, we cannot denigrate feminism by saying that, they've come to overpower men. That is a feeling of insecurity. She has right on, initially denied that. it is the power over oneself that brings out women into the realm. So, and she also says that we have to treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces, viewing them as if they were in the state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. Similarly, Simone Beauvoir, the very controversial, very attractive lady who wrote several books, and she is most known for her book, The Second Sex, which also has brought this phase into, has coined this phase, the second sex. Man is defined as a human being and a woman as a female. Whenever she behaves as a human being, she is said to imitate the male. So this is another thing, something like Margaret Mead, they are talking of the, similar, on the similar lines. The Western feminist wave, it is rather sad that we call this feminism. This is actually a struggle to come out into the open and rightfully get ourselves known as human beings. That is what women have been saying. Now, this is the suffrage movement now I'm pointing at, which is the first wave. Maybe that's not the actual thing here, subject here, but it is undoubtedly, it comes into play when we talk of the rights of women, how they were coming into play and how they were coming out from their folds, from their domesticity into the open. And these two, Anthony and Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these were the women who launched the movement for suffrage, and I'm sure all of you would be knowing how they had to struggle hard to get suffrage, to get the right to vote, that is, and to get voted. These are the two rights. This is the whole team they had created, and those days in the late 19th century, which was the first wave, they used to travel and they were imprisoned and they were badly treated. All that happened with them because they were asking for the right to vote, which we call today universal suffrage, which is so hard earned now. It was earlier manhood suffrage. Bretty Friedan was another very fiery women's activist, and she was very active in the 1970s, and she founded the National Organization for Women Now. She would say, no, nothing doing, we have to act now, and we have to ask for equal pay, equal work, equal, all the breaking the glass ceiling. Of course, suffrage, after suffrage, there were other issues. Coming to the Indian story, we also hear about these great ladies who fought for our freedom struggle. But before that, I'm not going into the ancient past, which was also full of, I must emphasize, full of great women, who had all the right to speak up, and everything was happening. And similarly in India, I have found during my research that they were not such, hard Victorian rules, I would say, morals where you were confined to the house. They were being brought up. These ladies, we all know about them, how they fought.
Hello, ma'am. Actually, your voice is not audible to us. Can you please check your audio, ma'am? Please bear with us. There is some technical issue from the side of our speaker. The speaker is joining with us soon. Please bear with us.
Please bear with us. Our speaker is joining soon. There is a technical issue from their side. Okay, there is some technical issue from the side of Dr. Yuthika Mishra. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Sonal to initiate his talk, her talk. Over to Dr. Sonal.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to express my thanks and gratitude to Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, and the organizing committee for providing me the opportunity to present my paper. Um, Today, basically, since we already have two sessions, and in the first session, the professor discussed about the relationship Myanmar, and then the second topic, which Dr. Mishra was speaking, it was very interesting topic, on which she spoke about the gender and women and gender. So today, basically, my topic is a little more different from the rest two topics which we already discussed in the morning. Today, I'm going to discuss about the classroom teaching and language barrier, a case study of tribes in Uttarakhand. So my paper, which I'm presenting today, mostly focuses on the contemporary challenges of the indigenous communities, especially in the state of Uttarakhand. Um, since the organizing committee is from Odisha, so of course the Odisha is home to a lot of indigenous communities, and one of the, I think, sponsor and the organizing member is also the Adivasi Institute. So I guess that will be more relatable. And from this, basically this paper which I'm going to discuss today is based on the empirical findings which I undertook for the project based on the Uttarakhand. So I'll just go into the brief about what my topic is and why I'm talking about the education and the classroom teaching and language barrier about the indigenous communities. So of course, my area of interest has always been the inclusive education, wherein I have tried to understand the development and progress of not just the mainstream society but also the segregated communities and the section of our country wherein they are still lagging behind a lot of factors. And one of the factor which really fascinates me is the education, because education of course is one of the most important ways by which we can move upward in the social strata and social stratification. And especially for the disadvantaged communities, for instance, like the tribals, or like we use different words to understand the communities. For instance, we can call them Adivasi, Janjati, scheduled tribe, which is a official term used for the indigenous communities, and aboriginals. So all these words are being has been used interchangeably, depends on depends on the situation or the official document. So the education really has a very significant role to play when we talk about the development of the tribes. So India, of course, has has a, has made a lot of progress in terms of health, education, and social strata. But still, we find that the kind of development which we expected for the inclusivity or the inclusiveness of the different sections is still missing. So a lot of studies, like I'll not go into the detail about the different studies, but a lot of studies are still highlighted that despite of lot of measures and the schemes and policies, the kind of outcome, the kind of development which we were expecting, especially from the tribes or the indigenous communities, is far from satisfactory. So India is of course a very vast and a very is a country of very diversity. And as you know, the census 2011 mentions that India is a single largest tribal population across the world, and the total tribal population in India across all the states and UTs is around 8.6% of the total population. And total more than 705 scheduled tribe communities has been recognized by government, wherein the different schemes and policies has been framed for their development, or framed for to involve them in the formal education system. So today, like I'm focusing on the tribes of Uttarakhand. So just to brief about the number of tribes and what are their cultures. So in Uttarakhand is a state wherein the tribal population constitute a very very small number. Like for instance, less than 3% of total population of Uttarakhand comprises of the scheduled tribes. So around 2.86% of total population of Uttarakhand is tribal, which is a very less percentage in as compared to the total population. And if we look into the contribution of tribes from Uttarakhand in the total population of India, is less than 1%. However, nonetheless, there's even though the population of tribes in Uttarakhand is less and it's very very small in terms of total population, their inclusivity plays a pivotal role. Their inclusivity is really very essential for the overall and holistic development. And in Uttarakhand, there are a total 5 tribal groups which are which have distributed in the different parts of the state. 5 important tribes are Bhotia, Jonsari, Tharu, Rajji, and Boxars. And these tribes are diverse in such a way that there are a lot of differences among these 5 tribal groups in terms of their dialect, language, culture, geographical location, the kind of, the occupation they are engaged in, their ethics, their beliefs, and other factors. So even though there are just 5 tribal groups in Uttarakhand, we find that there is a lot of diversity and variety. And among these 5 tribal groups, two tribal groups, Rajis and Boxas, comes under the PVTGs. PVTGs, as most of you must be aware, that it's a particularly vulnerable tribal groups. At present, government has identified total 75 tribal groups in India as PVTGs. Now, these PVTGs are particularly vulnerable tribal group, which are more backward. They still use, like, ancient forms of agriculture techniques. Their economical development is not as, not is not as better as, the other tribal groups. So all these 5 tribal groups are really very important. And in my paper which I am discussing today, I've tried to understand the classroom teachings. So this paper, which, or the talk which I am doing today, is based on the empirical findings of the project that I recently undertook in the state of Uttarakhand. So if we talk about these policies and schemes, when we want to bring them into the mainstream education system, we find that a lot of policies for bringing the tribes into the formal system of education has been into, existence, but still the policies or the schemes were found not much effective at the grassroots level. For instance, is my today's topic is classroom teaching. So a lot of challenges were found among these 5 tribal groups, and the challenges which was faced by each tribal group was varied from the other. Let's talk about the language issue and the mother tongue. Recently, we have a new policy for a new National Education Policy 2020, NEP 2020, which highlights the importance of use of mother tongue, especially at the primary level. It is being found that a lot of studies have mentioned that if the teaching or the classroom teaching is happening or is being, done in the mother tongue of the child understand the teachings in much effective way, in much detail. And if the language which is being utilized or used at primary level is not the mother tongue of the child faces difficulty in understanding the basics of the teaching learning happening in the class. Now, when we talk about the language issue, again, it is not similar among all the 5 tribes. For instance, if I talk about Bhotias and Tharus, so these two tribal groups in Uttarakhand are doing comparatively better as compared to the other 3 tribes in Uttarakhand in terms of their educational participation and their learning levels. Gradually, with Sanskritization and the globalization, we have found that the the penetration of knowledge and information has become little fast, and the Bhotias and Tharus apparently were quite successful in molding their ways and trying to imitate the culture, the patterns, and the language of the dominant community of Uttarakhand. Because of this Sanskritization and this cultural exchange, it was found that Bhotias and Tharus have literally, adapted to the new system, wherein they are speaking the language of the dominant community, and gradually we find that that their dialect or their mother tongue or the tribal dialect is getting extinct. Now, the majority of Bhotia children and Tharu children were found not having the fluency of their own tribal dialect, and they are more comfortable with the dominant language in the state, which is Hindi. So this kind of change or the shift is happening. It has started to happen among few of the tribes, which ironically has benefited the children to be a part of the mainstream form of education. On the other hand, the tribes like Raji and Boxas, they have not utilized or they have not been able to adopt themselves to the dominant society. They are still, especially Raji and Boxas, who are the PVTGs, it was found that they are still state segregated from the mainstream system, they are still shy. They stay in the, the at the from the distance from the main habitation. They prefer to be isolated. They do not want to, they do not willingly have interaction with the dominant society. Now with this kind of changes, it's found that all the tribals are not facing the same kind of challenge. So when I'm talking about the classroom teaching and classroom learning, the language, of course, let me mention about that. That in Uttarakhand, in majority of government schools, whether it is primary or upper primary, the major medium of instruction is Hindi. So Hindi is a dominant language in Uttarakhand. Apart from Hindi, other regional languages like Garhwali and Kumauni is also being spoken by from the by the um, dominant communities in the state. However, the teaching learning, the medium of teaching learning in government schools is Hindi. Now because of this, we find that the Bhotias and Tharus, even though they are the tribal groups, they have their own dialect, they have adopted to the language, so they are in benefit of learning better. And this benefit has been not been able to utilize by the other tribal groups like Jonsari, Rajji and Boxars, which we find that it becomes quite difficult and challenging when the students are getting promoted to the higher levels. In state, as we all know that the no detention policy is still active, wherein the students are supposed to be promoted automatically at least till grade 8. So we find that even though the actual learning is not taking place in the class, the child is getting promoted to the higher level at least till grade 8. And that is why the the dice data, or the dice data and the school education report mentions that there is a high dropout rate of scheduled tribe children in Uttarakhand after upper primary level, because the actual learning is not taking place. The child is getting promoted to the higher level, but when they are being being exposed to the higher degrees and higher challenges of the class 9, they are unable to cope up, and then they prefer to drop out. So if this kind of scenario exists, so when we talk about in NEP, we are talking about higher education and quality education. So the quality education was found totally missing, wherein the classroom learning is taking place, but because of the language and the dialect issue, we find that some of the tribal groups are lagging behind. However, few of them were fortunate enough to take the benefit and advantage of moving further. So with this kind of challenge, it is being observed that the one policy for all tribes was found like little not up to the mark, and it was being found that it is important to have a tribal centric or the tribal specific policy wherein we understand the need and requirement of the tribes. Now again, if we'll talk about the classroom teaching, and especially in the terms of pandemic, if I have to bring it, I find that it is one of the great disadvantage, and tribal communities especially is at the danger because of now all the on this classroom teaching has been totally shut down and online classes are happening, which of course the tribal community cannot cope up, because they are their their economical background. The children do not have the network, they do not have Wi-Fi. For instance, why I'm just talking about tribes, I can give you an example of my university. So currently I am in Uttarakhand and I'm teaching in HNB Garhwal University. My students are unable to join my classes because of poor connectivity and unavailability of the these devices like smartphones and the laptops. Out of my master's class, there are 20 students are enrolled, but only one or two are able to attend my classes online. So you can understand the scenario like dynamics of the teaching learning which is happening. Of course, the paper highlights on the classroom teaching, but with this change in the shift in the culture and the kind of new demands are being immersed, but the loss, the heavy loss is being borne by the tribal communities. So breaking to this classroom teaching, I find that the mother tongue is playing a very significant role in the low level of learnings. learning and the quality of education has been highlighted, has been given a lot of preference and lot of importance in the NEP 2020, because unless and until the quality education is taking place, or the actual learning is taking place in the classroom, the benefits or the fruits of the education cannot be borne by the students. And a lot of studies, like for instance, like Acer is conducting annual research and survey on the quality of education. The NCRT has also conducted the achievement test of the students. All these studies highlights that even though the child is getting enrolled in the formal education, they are attending classes, they are learning, but actual learning is not taking place. The basic arithmetic, the basic knowledge of the English and the science is totally missing from the students. And I'm talking about the general students. And if we look into the quality and the learning levels of the tribal students, it is far from the satisfaction. So the quality of learning, how we can improve it, unless and until the mother tongue of the tribals are taken care of, the teaching, especially at the primary level, is in the language which is being understood by the child, the basics cannot be, the conceptual clarity of students cannot be fulfilled. And this is why one of the factor, I'm not saying this is this is the only one factor, this is one of the factor for the low learnings and low achievement of the tribal children in the classroom learning. Now, classroom learning, the dynamic of the class is such that that the teaching is happening, but the student is not able to understand. For instance, there was when the study was undertaken, a lot of Raji students highlighted who were studying at the upper primary level. They mentioned that initially when they started to join the classes in the primary level, they could not understand anything what teacher was teaching, because they used to speak in their own dialect, their own language, but the teacher was using the Hindi language. So in the initial 3 grades, they were not able to comprehend anything what the teacher was talking, or the teacher was teaching. Only at the later levels, in the by grade 4 or grade 5, they were able to comprehend the teacher's teaching, and then they were able to understand. But because of this, they lost their initial 3 years, wherein they were supposed to know the conceptual clarity and basic arithmetic skills. But the issue of dialect or issue of the language is not homogeneous among all the 5 groups. So with the conclusion of this paper, I would highlight that the tribal centric policies are really very needs to be at place, because we cannot measure or weigh all the different tribal groups by one scale. The requirements, the demands, and the expectation of each tribal group is unique as compared to the other tribal group. And this kind of heterogeneity should be the center point while framing the policies for the development of education. Because if we are talking about NEP 2020, wherein the holistic and the inclusive development of all the strata or all the cultural society groups are being taken place, unless and until everyone is moving with the same pace, or their demands being taken care of, the holistic or the inclusive development of our society and other people cannot take place. And we definitely cannot segregate or isolate the tribal communities, which are very important part of our our cultural diversity. And unless and until we bring them into the foray of development along with the dominant and mainstream society, the actual growth and development of the holisticity of India cannot take place. So with this, I conclude my paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful lecture. Sir, yes, just I have to put my brief review that what you have said. that I have also gone through the article also written by Felix Pedel that have explained the travesties of the boarding schools in India and the politics of corporate funding to the residential school throughout India is to colonize tribal land, forest, water in an institutionalized manner, segregating tribal students from their indigenous culture, language, identity, and forcing them to assimilate with the dominant culture of the state through the institutionalized industrialization-led education reflect the heinous state corporate nexus and their capitalist agenda. So tribal students throughout the India are facing linguistic genocide because they have been forced to learn through the dominant language of the state. And government tribal policy is assimilationist one, in which they have been coerced to adopt the majority Hindu dominant culture. So how you look at this, ma'am?
I absolutely I absolutely totally agree with you, Subham Das, because when we are talking about assimilation, we are really not worrying about their culture and the death of their dialect. Because gradually, if we are trying or if we are pushing them to, bring them into the mainstream form or dominant culture, but what about their culture? What about their historicity? What about their their dialect, their belief system, their ethics? We as a government policy makers are really not bothered about their culture and how to preserve them, because we are in a way in the form of modernization or the modern formal education system, we are forcing them to replicate or imitate the dominant culture, but we are at the same time we are looking down on their own culture. The tribals are rich, the communities, they have a very rich culture, they have a tradition, they have a indigenous ways of curing a lot of health problems, they have their own medicines, their land. We all are in the way of in the uh, in the in the way by which we are forcing them the dominant and mainstream education, but we really need to look on this thing that whether they want to do that or not. It should be volunteered, it should be not be forced. But in this current scenario, what we are trying to say that the modern formal education system is the best for everyone, and we are in a way we are forcing them to be part of mainstream education system, and a lot of demerits has come, like you also mentioned, death of a dialect, death of a culture, and that of their own own traditions and belief system. So I feel like it is not just the situation of Uttarakhand or Odisha. I feel that this challenge has been faced by a lot of tribal communities across India, and we as academicians, we as researchers, we really need to look on this issue and how to how to solve this challenge of death of the culture of especially the indigenous communities.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Mishra, ma'am, to initiate her talk.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Shubham. I don't know, I just didn't realize, sorry about that I disconnected. Where did I leave exactly? I mean, if you would just let me know, because I think I was almost ending my talk and I got disconnected. So if you can just tell me, was it during the freedom struggle and women? I think if someone can tell me, because I just didn't realize that I had lost connection. Can you tell me where did I leave?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Just scroll. Yes, yes. From
yeah,
there, here.
Story? Indian, okay.
Indian story.
Okay.
From the Indian story. Yes.
Thank you for that. Please do let me know how, I don't know. This is what happens when you connect virtually, that you just don't know what's, although there are good and bad things both in this. So we were talking about the Indian story here and how these great ladies they had been trained in a way that they could manage both home and hearth, and they could fight as well as manage the domestic chores also. And these are some of the names we all know: Jhansi Ki Rani and Kittur Rani Chennamma of Karnataka, and how she fought the great battle with the British in 1824, was, imprisoned. But still, the point is that how they led the armies, which was considered, and even now it's considered, unwomanly. The Rani Durgavati was the queen of the Gonds in the mid 16th century and was very iconic. She defended her kingdom against the Mughal army, a very ferocious army. And she was well versed in fighting, horse riding, archery, you name it. And of course, they were married. They were managing the home affairs also. And there were, issues of succession and all also. But they would surpass, since there was the doctrine of lapse later on, which Rani Kittur of Chennamma had to, Rani of Kittur, she had to face the doctrine of lapse. Maybe you would know how, when you don't have a successor, the kingdom would lapse into the hands of the government, the colonial government. Then we come to this in the Northeast, the very famous Rani Gaidinilu, and she was the one who gave the war cry, "We are the free people, the white men should not rule over us." Very directly she led the people of Nagaland, on the whole of Northeast, at the very young age. She was imprisoned at the age of 16 and was only released when India got freedom. And so these women, they faced hardships of all sorts, as good as men. I was then talking about the social religious reform movement and how the known as the Indian Renaissance, of course, a very European term, but how it made a difference into the all-round development of women, and not only women, it was the whole society which grew up with women. That is the whole thing. And the question of the rationalism led to questioning of existing norms. What are we going to reform? What is it that is ailing the Indian society, and why then women are part of it, and how they need to be, promoted in these ways through education, through not, killing them at birth, genocide, all female infanticide, and those things were being practiced at that time. Parda, sati was in some areas. I won't say it was prevalent, but it was there. So such, these social mores. When you are thinking like that about women, there is some thing which is ailing the society. So these things need to be corrected, and that was realized at that time. So reforms got inextricably mixed up with the issue of, the political freedom of the country. And the downtrodden, the marginalized, especially the lower caste and women, were included in this whole scenario. There was the debate, a lot of debate around women and gender, which inspired the notion that how cultural nationalism, revivalism, reform, cultural nationalism, these were the terms that we, through which we study that period. But when you go back in that time, you realize that it was your culture which was being regenerated in order to fight a foreign force. And so much literature came up at that time, and which was also highlighting the position of women and how they need to be brought forth into the mainstream. With the coming of the 20th century, women got organized, and the role of Mahatma Gandhi was also seen, known as the creator of the mass movement of the freedom struggle. We saw a lot of emergence of women's movement in India. But of course, we also have to realize that he did bring the women out of the houses, but they were actually, they were not about to change the structure of the society. So that is one thing we need to understand. Of course, they were, contributing along with men in the whole scenario, and how the various organizations, like from 1917 onwards, there was a Women's India Association. They took a delegation to London to asking for franchise, and there were some ladies which you can recognize here: Sarojini Naidu and Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, some foreigners and some Indian from all over the country, and they got organized, which shows a great deal about the development of the women. This is the the main statement of the All India Women's Conference, which was formed in 1927. These are some of the archival photographs I've brought for you, which played a major role in building up an approach, an outlook of Indian women towards national issues. So it was both ways. The outlook of women was being broadened, and at the same time, the people of the country were realizing their importance and their contribution. This is their pointed program. The main points were equal rights for women, and they be treated as citizens. Their role should be very much recognized in society as citizens, and they should be entitled for voting, which of course they were then getting nominated by 1930s. Some of the photographs of the ladies, the leading ladies in the freedom movement, but that's not to forget that behind them was a big, huge crowd of, the women citizens of the country who were working hand in glove with the nationalist leaders to take the struggle forward. The ladies got so organized that they would pick up in every year they would realize what is important for them, then like laws for them, labor issues. Then there were reforms regarding inheritance and marriage. There were initially the All India Women's Conference was formed for education of women, and then it set up the Lady Women College, as you would be knowing. Then some of the Ranis were very important, their role. Why this was so? Because it was thought that they would be the great influence on the women folk of the country. So this was the Rani of Mandi, the Rani of Baroda, Maharani of Baroda, Gaikwad, and then there was the Begum of Bhopal, Rajkumar. There was a whole list who were, in the leading role and influencing and inspiring the women folk. One more thing that I wanted to point out before I end is that they were also organizing not just in the from afar as the leaders, but as the common man. They would lead on, they would march on, they would do the actual work. As we saw, they fought the battles with the British, these are the processions of the 1842 movement, Quit India movement, where this was the ladies group which was marching on. They were all over India. They would organized. They would take the flag and march on with the men folk, and they had their their contingents to work in the field. So when they had to do protests in March, I also wanted to bring in this issue of COVID, because if we see how gender is impacting women's roles in history. So, I took up the issue of the freedom struggle, but here in COVID also, they are at the receiving end. Their health issues, their well-being, their mental health, what are the rights, and the triple burden. All this needs to be understood in order to, figure out how gender is working in this whole scenario, and historically how this has helped or not helped women. That is for us to assess. So there's the triple burden of frontline work, unpaid care work, and the community activities. They are burdened with all this. They are burdened with the work of production, reproduction, community activities. They are in the front line of health workers, so many nurses and everyone. They are fighting like soldiers. Then these disease outbreaks, of course, are an additional burden on women. They have this, their situation is weakened during these times. And while they have additional burden, there is no alleviation of their responsibilities, or there's no special effort. But nowadays, I think there's a lot of work going on for helping women. There are policies being formed especially for women fighting in the front line, or the domestic workers, or the unorganized sector. Then, as during famine, war, natural disaster, disease outbreak, it is very well documented that the women's vulnerability is because of their gender. It increases because of their gender. So this needs to be realized. This needs to be fought. And this, especially in this pandemic situation, the same thing happening when there is a war-ravaged country. Women are, they are actually suffering more more than any other, stakeholders. And during this period, women endured a lot of burden of which was not in their control. So what is the solution? The public policy and health efforts need to be directed in such a way. They have to show their concern about gender and the issues that are faced by women folk of the country. And in this situation, women are doing a good job. These are some of the references that I've outlined for you, especially to deal with the COVID situation, what was happening in terms of their coping up and the emotional stress. A lot of mental issues have come up. Not only, I would say it is for everyone, but we have to understand the condition of women and how, because of gender, they are at the receiving end. Of course, the 20th century is women's century, is everyone's century. UN is working specially for women in all this, but we have to actually take care and understand and realize. And I thank you so much for bearing with me through this talk. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. You have very nicely explained the question of gender inequality and women rights. And the historical root of gender inequality lies in social constructivism, and also the mythological interpretation of some religious fictions and some stereotype. Social patriarchal tradition is also somehow responsible for the same.
Yeah.
So there are some questions in the chat box.
Sure.
Now, I want to go through one question asked by our speaker, Jyotsana Sonal madam. When we talk about gender as social construct, what is your take on third gender or LGBT questions?
You're asking me? No?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the third gender, the transgender studies are also there in a big way, the LGBTQ community. These studies are coming up in a big way. This also, what I just told is also speaks about all the communities which are at the receiving end, which are, not being given their due. That is one thing that we have to realize. It's not just about women. It's about all the communities who have the ability, they have to be given their due by the society. It's up to the society to give them their due and to realize that they are also human beings. You would have seen one slide. Feminism began with the very notion that we are all human beings, we are citizens. So this is true for everyone. That's why, once women are out of the box, several other communities are coming up. They are also staking their claim. They are saying that we are also human beings, consider us. So this is like a floodgate opening. This is more about humanism, more about being human, humanity, that everyone is a human being and everyone has to contribute in society in their own way. And we have to give them their due. So whether it's transgender, it's gay, everyone has to be. But one thing I would say that we all have to follow the rules and tenets of society, even in the women's issue. It's not that, and there's so many laws for women. It's not that you have been given these laws to misuse them. You haven't been given these freedoms to misuse them. Since you are a human being, you are a rightful citizen of the country. You have all the duties as well as responsibilities. Nowadays, we forget the responsibility. So, but then you have the right to contribute to the society according to your ability. And for all the studies, that's why, as I said, there's so many more studies coming in this way, and they're all emphasizing the humanistic aspect here. Of course, along with this, we have to also develop the social mores, as you said, mythology and all. See, we also misinterpret mythology in a big way, I would say. I'm not saying that you believe in whatever is being served to you in the name of our tradition or culture or mythology. But then we have to be very careful what is being, how we are interpreting it, and everything is bound to interpretation. We can interpret, do things in our own way. But the point is, there is a thing called social responsibility. And there is a thing called, like a present, a modern day emphasized in my talk. The roles have been changing. So when you put all these things together, you get the right picture for any community, for that matter, not just women.
Yes, ma'am. The Hathras incident, it is one of the heinous incident. This incident questions our very existence. In a civilized society today, even having stringent laws like Criminal Amendment Act 2018, we are unable to curb this pandemic of rape. Is rape mere a law and order problem, or it is a social problem? The growing crime against women has its roots in our patriarchal tradition. Ma'am, do you think that misogyny and commodification of women in telemedia are equally responsible for the growing menace of such crime like rape? Do you also think that the time has come for the introduction of a sex education and gender sensitization from the school level to change the mindset of our society and future generation as well?
Very good. I think this is a very relevant and very good thought. And you have said so many, stated so many problems in one sentence. I would go from the last bottom-up approach. Sex education is a must. It's a taboo. But as I said, sex is different from gender. How you treat women is what you are taught in society. That leads us on. From that upwards, if you go up, you see that if you don't have that misogyny, you have used the word, it's a very important word in women's studies. And in order to understand, we don't even realize we are misogynistic. That's the problem, in the society. And we just assume, okay, yeah, that's our behavior, that's how we are taught. And I'm not just talking of uneducated people. A lot of educated people, not just men, I'm also talking of women. We don't even realize that this is happening to us. So we are talking of an opening of mind, broadening of horizons overall. Sex education, talking about how to treat your colleagues, how to treat your friends in society, how to treat a boy or a girl if you are friendly with them. That is the basic level of existence of a civil society, which defines our civil society. If we call ourselves civilized, how do we define ourselves? So this is one thing which you have to realize. Shouldn't be a taboo talking about all that. And another thing that you pointed out is about the laws and the question of rape, and the Hathras incident, I believe, is highly politicized. At times things are hijacked. It is very unfortunate that such incidents are hijacked, and it's for the sake of politics that rapes happen. That is another issue that we have to realize. So the women are at the receiving end. They are being brutalized because I have to prove my point as a politician. That is very sad. That is another, an indicator that we haven't progressed. That's an indicator that we are still in the Stone Age. We are still not civilized, because we are using women for political purposes to prove our point. And this happens repeatedly. And of course, you can say, of course, a rape is a rape, is totally unpardonable. You have to have a law, such deterrent laws that the word doesn't even come in your mind. Like some even suggested, like hanging on the crossroads, चौराहे पर उसको hang कर दो. ये भी कोई बुरी बात नहीं है rape के case में. Not a bad idea, I would suggest. But law takes its own course, and it has a broad, it is blindfolded, it won't see, it won't do this, that. Not in the cases of rape, because such laws would go a long way in helping solve the problem of what society thinks about women. All women, whether they are educated, they are not educated. I'm not saying that the boys or men are not being brutalized. They are also being brutalized. But for women, there is this, there's a separate notion of misogyny, which is also responsible for so many crimes against them. So I feel, it's a mixed box of things where we need the laws, we need to have the social mores in a way where these laws are effective, and then we need to even take care of our adolescent, the children, that they, turn out to be good citizens, good adults ultimately.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for enlightening us today. Now I would like to request Mr. Rudra Narayan Das to go for a formal vote of thanks for this session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. It's my immense pleasure to go for a formal vote of thanks for this session. First of all, I would like to thank our esteemed guest, Professor Sekhar Basu, Professor Yuthika Mishra, and Professor Jyotsana Sonal ji for their insightful deliberation on various topics. I extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Vikram Kesari Jana, Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development Studies, Odisha, and Chinmay Sau, Executive Director, CARD, Odisha, for their friendly cooperation to organize this webinar. I would like to express my profound gratitude to our principal, Professor Pallab Chakravarti, for his cooperation in organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank the convener of this webinar, Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan, co-convener Professor Shubham Das, co-coordinator Payal Agarwal, and Baidhar Das for their support and guidance to organize this event. I am extremely happy to express the vote of thanks to the academicians, students, media persons, civil society members who have made this webinar a grand success by sparing their valuable time with us. Thank you all. The meeting is concluded now. Our next session is on 4 p.m. The eminent personalities of Odisha will be join us. Our guest speakers on 4 p.m. is